Good evening, everyone. Ooh. Welcome to Historic Congress Hall. My name is Cindy McLeod. I am the superintendent of Independence National Historical Park. I'm here to say how much we appreciate the partnership with the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. It is just an honor to have you with us at least once a year, so thank you for returning after we've all endured COVID times. These events bring life to this venerable historic chamber. This event showcases debate about current day issues, much as occurred when this was the Federal House of Representatives over 2 centuries ago, 1790 to 1800. We know it's a special night when the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia and the National Park Service are together, so welcome, welcome. Honoring the Spirit of America, a conversation about immigration is the title of tonight's program. It's particularly relevant because it was here in Congress Hall that the first immigration legislation for the new United States was passed. I'm going to review the first 10 years, a cursory review of legislation on immigration, and leave it to the specialists to take it from there. The Naturalization Act of 1790 set the first uniform rules for granting of U.S. citizenship by naturalization. The law limited naturalization to free white persons of good character who had lived here for at least 2 years. Thus, our nation's very first immigration law excluded many indentured servants, slaves, free blacks, Asians, and even those who had been here for thousands of years, the tribes and tribal communities of Native Americans. Another Naturalization Act was passed here in 1795, which raised the residency requirement from 2 to 5 years. By this point, our very first political parties had begun to develop, much to Washington's dismay, and they were drawing sides on the immigration debate. The Federalist Party of Washington, Adams, and Hamilton found it harder and harder to shake off their association with the aristocracy and British monarchy. They felt their grasp on the electorate slipping away to the new states' rights-centered party of Jefferson and Madison. Partially to maintain their power, in 1798, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed a series of 4 laws, which we refer to as the Alien and Sedition Laws. A new Naturalization Act raised residency requirements from 5 to 14 years. The 2 Alien Acts and the Sedition Act were really radical, and many say they wouldn't have been constitutional if they had gotten to the Supreme Court. And many at the time objected to the restrictions on freedom of speech, expression, and the redress of grievances. However, with the election of Thomas Jefferson to the presidency just 2 years later in 1800 and a Jeffersonian sweep of both houses of Congress, all but one of the Alien and Sedition Acts were repealed or expired rather quickly. Other naturalization laws remained in effect, and still more have been passed by the modern Congresses to address multiple types of immigration and asylum. As you know, over the centuries, wave after wave of immigration has brought people from all parts of our world to our shores. As President Obama stated, unless you're Native American, you have an ancestor who was born somewhere else. The issues surrounding immigration, asylum, and refugee status remain polarizing. Although I don't think we'll solve these issues tonight, or will we, gentlemen? There's no better place to discuss immigration than right here in the People's Chamber, the original House of Representatives inside Historic Congress Hall. So thank you. Thank you for being with us tonight. I hope everyone enjoys the program. I know it will be thought-provoking and inspiring. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Lauren Schwartz, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Superintendent McLeod. It is fantastic to be here. What an honor to sit in the chairs where the founding fathers fought, yelled, pounded on the table to try and come up with good ideas and policy. Most of us maybe remember coming here on a field trip wondering where am I and when is lunch and am I with the right school group, when we were children, and to sit in these chairs and have this discussion about an issue that is polarizing and complex and bipartisan, multi-partisan, and ever evolving before our eyes. We're really proud to be here tonight with our partners at the Independence National Historical Park and the National Park Service, and we thank you for this partnership, particularly to Superintendent McLeod, who's a wonderful friend of the council, and Park Ranger Bill Coughlin, who makes it all happen. You always need a good park ranger. And we'd like to thank the Paul E. Kelly Foundation, which supports this Liberty Series, which is an annual series of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, where we discuss things related to liberty, freedom, our country, and where we've been and where we're going. We've had a decade of support from the Paul E. Kelly Family Foundation, and we thank you for being here with us tonight. You make programming like this possible to create more discourse and dialogue to make sure that our democracy stays strong. We've got some cooperating partner organizations here too, the British American Business Council of Greater Philadelphia and the French American Chamber of Commerce. If you listened to some accents when you walked in, we definitely have some immigrants in the room here, and I know they'll give us some good questions tonight. I appreciate you all coming here and joining the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. For those of you we haven't met yet, the World Affairs Council is a 70-year-old nonpartisan nonprofit that connects Philadelphia to the world. We do that through about 25 speaker programs like this throughout the year. We provide world affairs education in 85 middle and high schools, making sure that our young people have access to ideas and places all around the world. We have professional development as well as 40 international trips around the globe each year. Our program format today is quite simple and straightforward. We'll have a moderated discussion followed by time for your questions and their answers, where we will do our best to solve some of these questions around immigration. There will be a microphone going around for Q&A, so if you have a question, raise your hand and someone will bring a microphone to you. At this moment, masks are optional in this building, so if you feel comfortable wearing a mask, please do so, but you are not required to at this moment. It is my pleasure now to introduce our moderator for this evening's discussion on immigration, Jonathan Grode. He's the U.S. Practice Director and Managing Partner for Green & Spiegel, a prominent immigration law firm in Philadelphia with offices in other countries and other parts of the U.S. He has served as an expert speaker and moderator on immigration law topics at the American Bar Association, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce, the French Chamber for Commerce and Industry, South by Southwest, and more. In his spare time, Jonathan also manages to be an adjunct faculty at Temple University's Beasley School of Law, where he is also a graduate. And we have two expert panelists with us tonight. David Beer, who is immediately on my right, is the Associate Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute. From 2013 to 2015, he spent time drafting immigration legislation for members of Congress who were leading on these issues. The U.S. Supreme Court and multiple federal appeals courts have cited his research and writing in grappling with these issues. And we also have Kent Smetter with us tonight, the Boatner Professor of the Department of Business Economics and Public Policy at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's served in that capacity since 1998. He's also the faculty director at the Penn-Wharton Budget Model, where they use research-based initiatives that provide economic analysis on the impacts of public policy. Prior to that, he served as an economist in the Congressional Budget Office and as a consultant for the World Bank and the Urban Institute. If these three gentlemen can't help us answer some questions, then I don't know what will. They'll share their expertise on the economic impacts of immigration and entrepreneurship, worker shortages that we're all talking about these days, quota systems, and hopefully some ideas of how we can help make this better. Jonathan, I invite you to the podium to start our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. It's really great to be here. As an attorney, coming to this building is sort of like the mecca of being a lawyer in the United States. So it's quite an honor, and I really want to extend extra thanks to the Park Services for the accommodation and the opportunity to be in Congress Hall. Okay, so today we're not going to be talking about politics per se. Obviously, politics is part of it, but we're not going to be doing like partisan politics as much as possible. But we're going to be talking more about not so much the effect of what our immigration policy is currently driving, but how our policy is the cause of the situation that we're currently facing. So we'll identify the issues, and we'll talk about some solutions. This is about economics. It's about entrepreneurship. It's about the American dream. It's about the opportunity to change the narrative about the discussion on immigration and to start to view it again as a benefit. The things that make us special, the melting pot, and not something that is used to divide us. This is a story about immigration and entrepreneurship and why people choose America. And it's interesting here, we got a really nice little brief history of the laws that were passed in this building. And one of them that I find most remarkable is something called the Jay Treaty from 1794. And you talked about the restriction on status and citizenship. The Jay Treaty actually was one of the first treaties that allowed for the free flow of people. And it said First Nation people, indigenous people from Canada could cross the border freely into the United States. At the time, it was Britain on the other side, right? And what's fascinating about the Jay Treaty, it still exists today. And it's something that I actually encounter quite a bit as having, my firm is actually headquartered in Toronto. And we see this stuff. The interesting thing is when the Canadians declared independence from the UK, they backed out of the treaty. But we still honor it. So we actually have one immigration law that is more liberal than the Canadians. That's pretty good. Okay, so we're going to talk about worker shortages, entrepreneurship, quota systems, and the economic realities. Getting into worker shortages and really opening up our discussion, I think there's some interesting statistics that can frame our discussion. Border Patrol agents reported to the Wall Street Journal in March of 2021 that the majority of single adults that are coming to the United States are not seeking asylum, but they're seeking work. They're seeking employment opportunities. 73% of people without status in the United States were employed in the United States. What jobs are they doing and why? And that is actually the same percentage of working population of legal residents in the United States. And if we look at our worker shortage today, within the accommodations and food service industry, there's an estimated 1.3 million open jobs. Retail trade, 970,000 open jobs. Manufacturing, 834,000 open jobs. And if any of us went down the shore this summer and tried to get a reservation at a restaurant, we all felt it, right? The delays were real. It was palatable. There's work that needs to be performed in the United States, but we don't necessarily have a mechanism for them to do it legally. There is no year-round visa for dishwashers. There's no year-round visa for home health care aides. There's no year-round visa classifications for cleaners. There's seasonal work and there's some provisions there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in terms of a legal mechanism for these people to enter the country and work, it does not exist. And what is that doing to our country? So David, I really want to just start with you and ask the question, is the undocumented worker population a sign of a work shortage? And how do you address that from a policy perspective?
Well, certainly it's a sign. First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. Certainly illegal immigration is a sign of a shortage in the number of visas made available to businesses and workers so that they can work legally, immigrate to this country legally. And usually illegal immigration is actually a leading indicator of the need for more employment. So it tracks overall employment incredibly well. If you look at what happened during the last major recession downturn in economic activity in 2009. There was a massive drop-off in illegal immigration. Same thing happened in 2020 initially, but the V-shaped recovery resulted in a huge spike in job openings and ultimately translated into more workers showing up looking for jobs in the United States.
And I mean, talking about this, and we see this as like such an unsolvable problem, but historically speaking, has there ever been a program passed by the government that's like addressed this issue in particular? And maybe you can talk a little bit about that in detail.
Well, certainly in the 1950s and 1960s, Congress made a concerted effort to deal with illegal immigration with visa policy when they created the Bracero guest worker program for Mexican farm workers. This was a concerted effort on the part of the Eisenhower administration, especially started under Truman, but really Eisenhower owned it and said, look, we're going to enforce immigration law extremely aggressively, but we're also going to have a visa policy that's as free as it can possibly be. And we started letting in over 500,000 guest workers from Mexico into the country, and illegal immigration went way down. Basically dried up until the middle of the 1960s when the program was eliminated and illegal immigration returned in a serious way and continued in a sustained manner for the next however many decades it's been, 5 decades after the elimination of that program. So this is a very important issue, but Congress mostly does not look at visa policy as a way to address what's happening at the border. They're basically in separate buckets when it comes to what policymakers are considering.
And is there a particular reason that there's a disassociation, or what's driving that disconnect? Is it constituent-based, or what is your feeling on that front?
Basically, people do not make the connection. Policymakers are not connecting what their policies are when it comes to illegal immigration with what's happening at the border. They think illegal immigration is driven by factors fundamentally separate and apart from what is driving people to come legally. And that disassociation has the consequence of having a lot of illegal immigration coming into the country.
And Kent, welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
We talk about, and there's a big difference here, there's a lot of family migration to the United States. Actually, like that's the majority of people coming to the US are through familial relationships. And you do get a lot of low-skilled workers that way. Is there a difference in your research between low-skilled undocumented individuals and low-skilled legal immigrants in terms of economic impact?
There is. What we see in the data is that undocumented low-skill workers tend to have a higher attachment rate to the labor force. It makes sense. If you're not working, you're not eating, you can't qualify for a lot of government assistance and benefits and so forth. Whereas documented workers, legal workers, often do qualify. And as a result, they have a lower attachment to the labor force, but at the same time, those programs allow them to upskill a bit more. If they're coming in lower skill, America is a magnet for education, and that often is not just fancy universities, but even community colleges and so forth, so it affords them the opportunity to upskill.
And, we talk a lot about amnesty.
Yeah.
And the last time we had like a blanket amnesty was under the Reagan administration. We had a quasi one in 2001. But there's a lot of debate over what the effect of providing status is. How does legalization of undocumented populations impact the economy?
Yeah, it's rather surprising because we first did this analysis during the campaign, Trump and Clinton, both looking at both their plans, very different from each other. And our analysis showed that neither was actually positive for the economy, even on a per capita basis. And in particular, legalization or amnesty has two offsetting effects. On one hand, you take undocumented workers, convert them to a legal status. That actually lowers their attachment to the labor force. But some of that lowering of attachment is we think is actually efficient because now they're able to make trade-offs and investments in their human capital and higher returns. But that upskilling then increases their productivity. And on net, it basically offsets maybe a slight negative on a per capita basis, but it's basically zero.
There's often been a view of protectionism, and that's sort of politically swapped between parties historically. But the argument is if you let lower skilled people into the country, it's going to take those jobs from U.S. workers. How does that bear out in research?
Yeah, and it basically doesn't. In particular, so we have to break it down between, say, GDP per capita that includes the new arrived immigrants, and then some people look at GDP per kind of native-born worker. The idea being we're the receiving nation. What's in our interest to receive these people? And what the evidence shows is that low-skill workers typically do not lower the wages for lower-skilled native-born workers. And the reason why is that immigrants, when they come in, they typically lack language and communication skills of lower-skilled native-born workers. And so what happens is that native-born workers essentially get crowded upward to jobs that actually play off of those skills. And those jobs tend to pay better than jobs that don't require those social skills and those communication skills. So that crowding upward it tends to be associated with a higher wage, not a lower wage for native-born, where we do see some negative effect, but surprisingly, it's very little and it's very temporary. And we saw this with, you mentioned Reagan with Cuba and so forth, is that those who previously immigrant population, those who had previously immigrated to the United States, they often have not adopted social skills or their communication skills. So I think of my wife is an immigrant. Her parents, who have been in the United States for 40 years, I hope they're not watching this, but their English is still not great. It's often very challenging communicating with them because they took jobs where that skill was not that important. And so they were able to do kind of minimal transactions or engage in transactions without relying on those skills. Those workers tend to face more competition from new arrivals of immigrants. And you would think that would be pretty significant, especially as you look at certain events like during the Reagan administration. There was a slight negative impact on wages for those workers, but it was very small and very temporary.
Well, one of the big reasons why the wage effects of immigration are so small is because if immigrants are coming in, that spurs new investment into capital, and capital makes people more productive. And so as immigrants come in, businesses reinvest, and that brings up the wage. So there's not, in the long term, the wage effects, most economists would say, are around zero. For both native-born and immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about, so immigrants we call it the barbell approach. They tend to be often very high-skilled and often quite low-skilled, less in the middle. We often think of these high-skill as very much complements the existing workers. They're the ones who are running big Fortune 500 companies now, creating lots of jobs, entrepreneurship, and so forth. The low skill are often viewed as just pure substitutes, but that's not quite true. As he just pointed out, in particular, in some cases they can even be complements. You're the farmer who's higher income. You need that, fill those jobs, and that's actually a complement to your own productivity. And so it's not always a pure substitute with existing low skill. In fact, it often is not.
I mean, you touch on high-skilled labor, and I think that's the other side of the coin. It's worth discussing a little bit. I don't know if you guys know, but we had a major bill passed for the semiconductor industry recently, which was the CHIPS Act. It was like a lot of money being pumped into our semiconductor companies that are based in the United States to bring manufacturing back to the United States, R&D to the United States. But in that bill, providing billions and billions of dollars, no mention of workers, no additions for bringing in or developing STEM talent in the United States or being able to attract immigrants that are highly skilled. And I think that the worker shortage, we'll talk about it a little bit more on the quota stuff, but it's equally impacting the high-skilled labor. And from a policy perspective, what's the viewpoint at Cato on these things?
Well, if you look at just the H-1B visa lottery for this last year, 75% of the registrations went straight in the trash. So you're doing a lottery to decide whether companies can hire skilled workers. Over 70% of them have master's degrees. They're almost all in computer science or other similar STEM fields. And we're basically, as a country, deciding which companies get to hire skilled foreign workers based on a lottery system. And that's totally, almost by definition, random and arbitrary and irrational. And so the demand is far outstripping the supply of visas. And it's getting to the point where you see Microsoft, you see IBM, majority of its employees are now outside the United States. Microsoft is building offices in Canada. They started that 2 decades ago when we started this experiment with the H-1B lottery. The first time we had a lottery, the reaction was, well, we were going to have to go to a country like Canada that allows us to hire skilled foreign workers. So the policy reaction to the restriction is not, we're never going to hire anybody, we're not going to, these jobs aren't going to be created. The question is whether the jobs are being created in the United States or somewhere else in the world.
And I think that the Canadian example is particularly acute, and we'll reference Canada a lot, but you guys have heard of offshoring. Well, there's a new concept for this kind of situation which we refer to as nearshoring, where you have individuals that are working in the same time zone, so the clientele feels, because of the remote work aspect, that there's no difference, and they're just north of the border. And Canada has a totally different view on immigration. I don't know if you've studied that, but they're...
Yeah. So, I mean, if you go through Canada, about over a fifth of its population, over 20% of its population is foreign-born. In the United States, it's less than 15% foreign-born. And if you do the math on that, the 5% is massive in the context of a 330 million person population here in the United States. So, I mean, 15 million people short, at least, as a result of the fact that we have these restrictions on immigration, that Canada, on a per capita basis, they're looking to attract more people. The United States is basically doing the opposite through policy.
And I do want to talk a little bit, move on to entrepreneurship momentarily, but we talked a lot about micro and macro economic theories behind migration. And Kent, from a macro perspective, like long term, where does immigration fit into the growth of the economy?
Yeah, it's certainly from a total GDP perspective, it's positive. From a even per capita, per native born perspective, it's still slightly positive. And so then the question, and it's because of these complements. Immigrants are typically not as substitutes as often is perceived, but there are a lot more complements to existing workers. But then the question becomes, why would you care about total GDP versus, say, GDP per capita? When we think about standards of living, a very common metric, although imperfect, that compares across the OECD and other countries, typically is GDP per capita, not just total GDP. But having bigger GDP itself can have some advantages. It can allow you to take risk. For example, as a country, we can engage in research and development risk, knowing lots of those things will not win. They will never make that new great company, that research that's funded by the NIH, NSF. A lot of that will not go anywhere, but you don't have to have all those wins. High percent, just a few wins can just be radical and change the world. Think of the transistor, think of lots of other general purpose technologies that way. And so when you have a bigger tax base, you can diversify that way. And then there's also issues about be able to be a bit more kind of nationalistic and be able to grow. It can also help you compete in a world where maybe part of that competition is not just pure economics, but it's your ability to fund things like basic military and other things that have fixed costs associated with them. And so, in fact, I think what you're going to see is over the next decade, the attitude toward immigration, especially now that the United States is no longer replacing itself. You basically need 2.1 people per female between childbearing age to just remain population level. We're below that. We're now approaching Europe. And so without immigration, we're actually going to shrink as an economy.
And I think you see that in examples like what's going on with Japan and the concerns over an aged population and how they're going to supplement retirement.
And so I think the race will be, I think within a decade, we'll be back 1980s style or even earlier, where we'll actually be competing a bit more for immigrants, because economies like Germany would shrink without immigration. And there is a lot of fixed costs of running a successful country. And in terms of public infrastructure, in terms of military, in terms of lots of other, risk-taking that you do. And so size does actually matter.
I think this gets to really the fundamental question of what we're saying when we ask the question whether immigration is good or bad for the economy. Ultimately, what we're asking is whether new people coming in are going to improve the material prosperity of the United States or not. And the answer to that question has to be yes. We've known since Adam Smith that the division of labor is the source of all prosperity. The poorest person in the world is Robinson Crusoe, stuck on the island doing it all himself. It doesn't matter how smart he is, he needs other people to contribute to that pie to help him become more productive. And so by keeping all these people out, we're not creating prosperity for ourselves. Closing ourselves off from the world is not going to be the basis for prosperity anywhere, at any time throughout history. And societies that have experimented with population decline have not liked the consequences. It's bad. Seeing vacant homes on your street, there are plenty of cities throughout the United States that have seen exactly this, a population spiral where we're losing tax base, we're losing workers, we're losing consumers, businesses are moving elsewhere, and it's a death spiral. You do not want to enter that scenario. And that's the path that we're on without immigration, and it's a path that we're choosing by keeping immigration as closed as it is right now.
Well, I think that really does frame the worker issue very well. I'd like to now switch gears a little bit and talk about entrepreneurship. Some interesting statistics to frame this discussion, but 45% of the Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants. 45%. 223 companies. Those 223 companies in 2019 did $6.1 trillion in revenue. That's more than the GDP of Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom, in the United States. Some of the largest companies were actually founded by immigrants. Apple, Costco, Broadcom, even Levi's, the jeans, that's from foreign nationals. And there's a lot of situations that I've experienced personally that say, this is where people are attracted to start businesses. It's more than just the availability of venture capital money. And I had a group of entrepreneurs that I was talking to about immigration solutions. And I asked them, why America? And one guy's answer to me sticks out in my mind, and I still can hear it right now. He said, America is a place where you're applauded for trying. Where even if you try and you don't succeed, you're still successful. And when you fail, you can try again. And many other countries around the world, very realistically, if you fail, you're labeled a failure. You don't get a second chance. If you talk to an entrepreneur, foreign national or American, and you ask them how they got to where they got to, they will tell you about how they failed first. They will tell you about sleeping on their friends' couches, eating ramen out of a bowl, whatever, for 15 weeks in a row. We are drawn to this self-starting nature. It's part of our DNA. But is our immigration policy closing the door? And a story about an Indian immigrant who actually went to Penn. He tried to get an H-1B through Microsoft and he didn't win the lottery. So he moves back to India and ends up starting one of the largest e-commerce companies in the entire world called Snapdeal. That could have been in the United States, but it's not because we didn't have a visa policy that allowed him to develop that program. In fact, the United States is one of the only developed countries that does not have an entrepreneurial program. We keep referencing our brethren to the north in Canada, but they have a policy where not only will they give you a visa to develop your idea, they'll give you money to do it too. And I guess the question that I would pose to you is, are we turning our back on a core principle of being American by not allowing foreigners to easily develop to become entrepreneurs in the United States?
Well, I certainly think that this is a fundamental value, and it's one that Congress has repeatedly recognized the shortcoming of only to package it up with a bunch of other policy ideas that were going nowhere and to see it sink. And so I've seen bill after bill be proposed and it goes down because they try to attach it to some, they attach the popular thing to the unpopular thing and the popular thing goes down. But the reality is many of these restrictions do come from administrative policy, and the administration deserves blame for how it's implementing our laws as well. But the most important factor here is the fact that we're all based around this idea that you need to come as an employee of a business. And that's the nexus. That's the way you prove your economic value. And so Congress structured our laws all around this employee-employer relationship, which as an entrepreneur, you're creating you are the employer. And so the administration has basically said, we're not going to let you self-sponsor yourself for a visa, even though this would be the greatest spur to innovation we've ever seen. There are numerous examples. Eric Wan, who founded Zoom video conferencing, I mean, it was a lifeline throughout the pandemic for businesses everywhere. He was denied an H-1B visa 8 times before he finally won. And then he had to come as a worker before he could actually come up with his idea and implement it when he finally got a green card years later. So we're delaying innovation, we're delaying this ability to contribute not just to the United States, but to the world economy as well.
Yeah, even, there's, I think, 2 dimensions to your question. One is our core principles and our identity as a country. And certainly, there's no question that there's value of immigration from that perspective. Even from a selfish perspective, it really, so even just looking at native-born workers, what's the impact on them? The immigrants tend to be a complement, not a substitute. And so it tends to be positive experience for them as well. So a couple things you mentioned, the Fortune 500. If you look at the companies that are in the Fortune 500 today and go back 25 years, they were not in the Fortune 500. The Fortune 500 accounts for about 80% of all listed shares in the United States. Sure. And it is by far probably your biggest investment in your S&P 500 portfolio, roughly the same thing. And it is, but there's tremendous turnover. What we've seen in the data is that innovation has actually slowed down over time. And certainly more immigration can actually spur that back. And so even from a purely, self-interested perspective, there is immigrants are bringing value.
Do you see, and this is also something that's interesting. So just to kind of put it in context, for certain countries, there are ways to be an entrepreneur if you invest, but we don't have it for all countries. So most Western countries have access to a visa called E, which is an investment-based visa. Why do we limit it? We don't have it for Brazil, Russia, India, or China. There's no ubiquitous visa classification. And where is the root of this
Well,
parity?
you can just scream, unfriendlies. There's reasons why it's often correlated with countries that we often saw as a threat and so forth. So it's often, when I think of, my days at Congress or now as an employer who faces both capped and uncapped H-1Bs, there are different rules based on origin. And it's much easier for me as an employer at Penn when I have my secondary appointments in the math department. Most of my students are Chinese. Less hassle as an employer at Penn. And so it was alluded to earlier, it's not just the absolute level of these visas, it's actually how it's constructed as well, the program specifics. The H-1B, you have this lottery. Well, master's students get 2 lottery tickets, undergraduates get kind of 1 lottery ticket, and then you can kind of game the system if you have multiple sponsors, and so you can get, so it's like, why do admit rates at Penn and other prestigious schools go down? Because people are applying to more and more schools as the admit rates go down. So you get these knock-on effects here. But then so there's the H-1B thing, but then to go to the green card, the immigration lawyers, I'm sure you have to ask your clients this all the time, I cannot say why this person is well qualified for this job. I cannot say that they're the best qualified for this job. I have to make the argument they are the only qualified person for this job. And it just happens to be the jobs I often offer have this incredible combination of specific skill sets of math, PhDs or master's degrees with other skill sets where I can make that argument legitimately. But it is, the hurdles there are just, just incredible.
Well, let's break down some of this quota-based stuff and some of the delays, because it's kind of eye-opening. So we alluded to the H-1B lottery. Okay, we have a quota of 85,000 a year. That's it. Every year it's oversubscribed, so they started a lottery. Fiscal year 2023, which starts on October 1st, they ran the lottery in the spring. There was 483,000 filings for 85,000 spots. That was a 57% increase from fiscal year 2022. Okay, just to put that in perspective. If we're looking at some of our lower skilled workers like the H-2B, we allow 66,000 of those annually, although they do put a little buffer in and increase it. Those are oversubscribed the first day available. That's why down the shore, when you have your summer work, there was a lack of people there, because they couldn't fill the jobs. But it even gets worse when you look at immigrant visas, green cards. So not only do we have quotas on preference categories, and you were kind of talking about like the best of the best, that's called EB1, and there's EB2 and EB3. But you not only have it based on preference category, you also have it on per nation quotas as well. So you got like a 2-factor identification system going on to get a green card. They are currently processing for Indian nationals. So if you're an Indian national, you come to me and say, Jonathan, I want you to help me get a green card. I'm like, cool. They're currently processing cases that were filed in 2012. And if we start today, the estimate is going to take 40 years for you to get your green card. For Chinese nationals, it's a little bit better. It's only about 12 years. But the rest of the world, it's okay. And it's based on these numbers. And I guess, really, we have so much information about jobs. We have so much information about industries and shortages and where they are. You heard at the beginning, we were able to pinpoint how many open jobs there are in specific fields. Why aren't we being smarter with our policy, and we're still driven by this really antiquated notion from the 50s of a quota-based system?
Well, I think it's based a lot on how politics works. It's an anecdote-driven industry, and we're living in fear of the single anecdote that could bring down the entire immigration system, where one American is displaced from a job, and therefore we think it's okay to have 11 million jobs unfilled. So all of those jobs that that could be filled by an immigrant, that could be producing for consumers, that could be making our lives better, that could be lowering prices and expanding production and producing wealth in this country, go unfilled because of that perpetual fear of that one person. And then the ultimate consequence of that is both the fact that we have this crazy quota system that was created, really the origins of it in the 1920s, because we didn't want to have too many immigrants from certain types of countries, and really the same theory still applies today. We want to have diversity. We say it's in the name of diversity that we're making the Indians wait 4 decades. I think it's even longer now. It's really a lifetime that they'll be waiting.
They caught up during the pandemic a little bit.
Huh?
They caught up because they weren't.
Yeah, they did process a little bit,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, what we're dealing with is a system designed based on this fear of the anecdote, and not based on statistics, not based on actual economic analysis of the big picture. And so we run everyone through a very restrictive system for that reason.
And Kent, I mean, from an economic perspective, is there a better system that's out there? Or, I think you would have a tough time selling free market reign on visas, but.
Yeah, but things like worker programs where you come here, you can work, you don't necessarily you have the right to vote based on that alone, that permit. You don't have the right to transfer programs, at least at the federal level. All the evidence shows that could be done pretty fast, and it's pretty stimulating to the economy. And those who come, it's not trickery. They are making wages much higher than they otherwise would have in this sending country. And workers in the United States are typically filling jobs that they otherwise could not fill, and it's a compliment to them. Not every discussion of immigration has to be a path to citizenship. There could be, maybe there is a path, but it's a long path. But you can have lots of fluidity of movement. Immigration policy can have significant impacts. I mean, you think about, people forget, in World War I, Japan fought on the side of the Allies. World War II, we fought against Japan. And in particular, that part of that switch was, in fact, the U.S. immigration policy in the 1920s that was being referred to. That was part of the flurry that of Hirohito and Tojo and so forth. A very parallel system happened in Japan that was happening in Germany during the 20s and 30s. And, immigration policy played a big role in that. And it is, the knock-on effects can sometimes be very significant.
And one of the things that's kind of lost in this is the fact that a lot of these people that are applying for these H-1B visas have gone to school here. They've been here as undergraduates, and universities rely on foreign student population more than they ever have. They get higher tuitions, they come over, there's more interest, et cetera. If you've been here and you do your undergraduate for 4 years, and then you do a master's degree so you can get your 2 lottery tickets, our current system does not favor those who have been here and studied here, really. I mean, there's a slight advantage, but there's not a massive advantage. And from a policy perspective, what does it mean to sort of educate, train, assimilate in a lot of respects, and then say, sorry, you didn't win a lottery? David?
Well, we're exporting a lot of talent to other countries, and it's hard to be sad about that from the perspective of the world economy. It's certainly a problem from our economy, but it's also a problem for the world economy as well, because they're not contributing to their greatest extent. I mean, that's the disappointing thing, is if the United States provides the opportunity for people to reach their highest potential, and that's what's disappointing when we're forcing people to leave the country. Talented people who could be contributing, not just to the United States, but I mean, Zoom and these other companies that have been founded here are worldwide, and they are benefiting everyone on the planet. And we would like to see more of that spur more of that type of innovation by having a better immigration policy.
And Ken, I mean, you work very closely, as you said, with a lot of Chinese students. And how does that concern, I mean, this is more of a personal thing, but how does that concern affect them? I mean, you experience it firsthand.
Yeah, the relationship that universities have with China is a complicated one. Universities take a lot of moral stances, except on China, because of the fact that Chinese students pay full freight, and on top of that, we get lots of donors who make 5-year commitments, and those commitments may, the Chinese government may pressure those donors to not make good on those commitments if we talk bad about, human rights abuses in China and so forth. So you don't hear universities in the United States talk about the Uyghurs, talk about any of those types of abuses. Chinese students in the United States are in an incredibly complicated position. Often they are very much, they are able to make us, in the United States, we're able to separate the party in power from the love of your country. That dichotomy is much harder and much more foreign with Chinese students. And so they do relish and enjoy the freedoms. At the same time, they have a complicated relationship, in terms of their country vis-a-vis Taiwan, Hong Kong, and of course the Uyghur population are being, basically in slave camps right now. And so I think it is, a lot of them do want to say, so research at the university level is harder and harder. I mean, if you look at the time to publication, it is just stretching out more and more years. I've had so many projects where I'm racing against the clock. Now, you might say mathematics, you can do that remotely. Some truth to that, but not really. It's so much better to have that whiteboard and online whiteboards, trying to write, weird topology equations and so forth on online whiteboards is a lot more challenging.
I think actually math has like the longest time to publication.
Yeah,
all
it's
the
super
fields.
long. And, I've had papers published in our top journal that, I started 7 years earlier. And it is and they're coming here for really the best universities in the world. And, it's a magnet, and we're creating all this training for them. And there would be a lot of value if they could basically stick around.
So you've heard a lot from us, and we've talked a lot about the cause of immigration issues that we have now. We'd love to see if you guys have any questions or anything, a statement even. Yes, sir. Wait for the mic, please.
So in my younger days, I did a lot of door knocking for political campaigns. And what I would hear quite often is somebody was afraid that the white population would become less than the immigrant population. And of course, this must influence congressmen's and other people's votes when it comes to creating a much fairer immigration policy. And I think this is a problem that you really haven't, the psychological part of many of a significant portion of the population who's afraid of us becoming no longer predominantly white.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question. I'd love to get your take. I mean, you've seen this with different waves of immigration. You saw it with the Irish when they came. They were viewed as different, but they assimilated. You saw that with the Italians, and even the Jews were able to assimilate afterwards, but once you have a different appearance or color, it becomes harder. I think you talked a little bit during our prep sessions about, and this is a tough subject, but you talked about what Sweden does and how that relates to assimilation and addressing the concerns that you raised.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at countries that had success, what we generally would say are success records with immigration, we think of places like Switzerland and so forth. And then we think of countries that not done as well. We think of maybe France, where we have growing anti-Semitism now. You think of Sweden and so forth, which is now going through some big elections and so forth. And what seems to be the key difference, Switzerland has this attitude, you can come, but you are going, and we respect, your cultural heritage and so forth, but you are assimilating, you are Swiss. And if that is not what your attitude is, You don't have to come. I mean, and the idea that there's an expectation that you are identifying with the receiving country, and versus other countries that try to, and you mentioned it's a tough subject, especially at a place like Penn, because we often say, well, cultural diversity is a great thing. Well, yes, but then you simply have to ask the question, in the United States, we have lots of cultural diversity, but where is your primary identity? Is it in your culture, and your country is second, or is it first in your country that then respects your culture? And places like Afghanistan and other countries have really struggled with tribalism. The identity first is with your tribe, then maybe with your country. And those are the countries, tribalism, there's lots of stylized facts out there. Tribalism, countries that practice polygamy, and so forth, none of those countries do well. And more tribalism is actually typically negative for economic growth, whereas nationalism is typically that respects heterogeneity, but at the same time, there's an assumption of assimilations. Typically, those countries have a much better track record with whether it be violence, whether it be economic growth, and so forth.
Yes, over there. Got you next. Yeah, over there.
I'd like to shift the discussion away from economics more toward human rights. As you know, large numbers of people are streaming across the southern border and immediately applying for asylum. Could you explain what's involved in establishing a case for entering the United States as an asylum seeker, and give your assessment of how that system is working, and if it's broken, how can it be fixed?
That's a really great question. I will give you a 30-second primer on asylum, because it's actually a very complex area. But essentially, when you are seeking asylum, it can't be a general country condition that you're trying to escape or you have fear of. You have to have a successful asylum application, you're supposed to have a specific threat against you personally, whether it be political, religious, or any other group that you're associated with that's being threatened in your home country. The issue, and where the previous administration had a lot of problems with asylum, is that these people were coming and making these claims based on general country conditions, a generalized fear without specifics. And kind of, not to bring it back to economics generally speaking, but when we talk about giving them a mechanism for entering the labor force rather than claiming asylum, that's the different perspective that we're trying to say. You know, as we talked about those border statistics, the majority of people are coming here for economics, not, you know, they're escaping from hard situations, but does it fall under asylum? And that's the question that we're sort of ignoring. I don't know if you want to add on to the law of it, but.
Well, I mean, I agree with all of that, and I think there is a better system. You know, it relies on having people be able to immigrate legally. There's never going to be a situation in which, you know, Venezuelans, I mean, they're dealing with so many different crises there. Many of them are political dissidents. Many of them are fleeing persecution based on a political ground, which is one of the requirements for asylum. But many of them are just fleeing the fact that the economy in Venezuela collapsed, and they're homeless and they have nowhere to go except seek asylum in the United States. And they're seeking it in a generalized sense. They don't know what the laws are. They're just showing up and saying, look, I have nowhere else to go. Please take me in. And there needs to be a pathway for situations like that. It can't all be around these classic cases of asylum. Not everyone is fleeing the Holocaust or a specific persecution based on religion, race, or political opinion. And so there needs to be a different way, a different approach to dealing with crises. I mean, we saw with Central Americans late in 2020, they had hurricanes just wipe out whole villages, destroy towns, massive displacement. It was like, you know, Hurricane Katrina displaced a huge percentage of the population in Louisiana, but they had places to go. They could go to Texas, they could go to Oklahoma, they could go to surrounding states. these people had nowhere to go, so they went to the US border. And we tried to expel them as fast as we could. We tried to deport them as fast as we could. We're spending billions of dollars in trying to suppress people's urge to seek the American dream. And it doesn't make sense. It's a waste of resources, and it's, I consider it a violation of human rights, but and so does the United Nations, but certainly the United States
And just
doesn't.
really quickly, too, is that the asylum system, I mean, this classic game theory takes over. You know you have to come up with a specific story. And so everybody comes up with a specific story. And so now we have a ton of noise. The noise signal ratio is like super high. So now, how do we know we can believe your story? Come up with evidence that a gang is really trying to hunt you down. Well, how do you come up with that evidence?
Yeah.
You have to be shot first? I mean, how do you come up with that evidence? And that makes it extremely hard, whereas an economic-based one is a much more objective path.
And people know that, so if you're in the US and you file for asylum, the system is so backed up. It's like 7 years before your case is even heard. So attorneys actually use it as like a mechanism for maintaining status. It's quite complicated. The gentleman in the back had his hand up for a moment. Oh, you got a microphone behind you.
Kind of a pragmatic question without getting too political. You talked about each year there's the 85,000
Yep.
work visas. There were like 460,000 who applied. With the current shortage of labor that more and more people are seeing, they go to their coffee shop, they go every place else, see the hours are less, see these businesses struggling. What can be done pragmatically? We probably could take all 465,000 in each year. What could be done to do that? Is it a bipartisan group with business leaders and pragmatic people from all the different parties and the media and you to do so? I don't know. I'm throwing it out as a
it'd
question.
be interesting to see what the panel say. I mean, if you talk to any politician off the record, they'll be like, yeah, we got a big problem, we got to fix it.
Right.
But it's that political impetus to do it doesn't exist. I'd be curious to get your take without getting too political. The last 2 times we've tried to address this situation was through comprehensive immigration reform in 2007 and 2013. They wanted to create an omnibus change. And even Biden, in his first day of office, put like a 700-page bill on the doorstep of Congress that didn't get, I don't think it got cracked. But we have this idea of saying, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, we got to pack all these things in there to get as much support behind it for maybe they're a chance of passing. People are very reluctant to say, let's just take this one little issue of immigration that we know is a big problem and put a bill out there. And when I referred to the CHIPS Act earlier, to me that would have been a great opportunity to change the numbers because it had so much support behind it. But again, immigration is so politically transient and misunderstood that it's become stalled. It's very, very, very stalled. And we haven't had any major immigration legislation since 2001 and really 1996 if you want to talk about change. But
When you think about forcing functions, what would, just being vague, I can talk about skill complementarities. That doesn't move, votes and move audiences and so forth. But you need, usually something like some type of forcing function to move that. And I'll tell you one, I think that could be big, and that is think about medicine in the United States and delivery of healthcare in the United States. About 20% of GDP, depending on how you count certain things. And think about the demand for healthcare and medicine as baby boomers are going into retirement, which will continue up through 2035. Think about the supply of medicine. Where is that coming from? People going into retirement. So you're having demand increase and supply contract at the same time. And so what's going to fill that gap? And we often don't think of immigrants as being the medical providers, but in fact, that's how Canada, think about how many nurses were in Canada because they in fact targeted, medicine and so forth. I think that will be one of those, now you're affecting a very broad, the problem with technology, chips and so forth, it's so indirect to us. Not being able to see your doctor for 3 months, that's a That's a different conversation
And
at
like,
that point.
currently, from an immigration perspective, if you come here as a foreign medical graduate, you get a J1 visa. It forces you to go home for 2 years after you finish your training. So we actually like make people leave in order to come back to be doctors. Unless you're going to a medically underserved area, there's a waiver. And
Yeah,
there's a-
yeah.
Well, it's basically illegal to come in and just be a physician. You have to get this J1 training in order to get a license in the United States to be a physician. In order to get up to the same per capita level, physicians per capita, as many countries in Europe, we would need about 1 million more doctors, basically double the total number of physicians, to give you the scale of the shortage that we're talking about. So this, to answer your question, the answer is that we should staple a green card to every graduate of a U.S. university. This would totally take care of the H-1B issue, because the majority of the people entering the lottery are graduates from U.S. universities. These are people who've already been trained. We already know, that they want to contribute to this country.
I mean,
So
let's not put the immigration attorneys out of business by stapling the green cards.
there's plenty of work in the asylum space, I understand. So,
But I mean, and you know who famously talked about stapling green cards? It was the GOP after they lost to Barack Obama in 2012. So I mean, it's fascinating that respect. Yeah, Stephanie, I think you need a mic.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to say, I don't know if I feel more hopeful or less hopeful now, because there were so many points of agreement between our panelists. I think what I'm coming away with is that our politics are not in any way rational or evidence-based. And I think that the very first question that was asked about fear and about tribalism, really, I mean racism, really, is driving politics more than any policy or evidence or logic, even to the detriment of the voters themselves, that people are voting against their own self-interest. And so I guess the question I have is there a policy way past that fear or back from that fear? Can policy bring us back, or is something else needed?
I actually think that's a brilliant framing, because a lot of the concern is not about race, it's about order. If you dial back into what is causing anxiety, it's the disorderly process in which people are entering the country, and it breeds into everything. So it goes into all these spaces about legal visas, and people don't want to increase legal immigration when we've got chaos at the border. People on Capitol Hill say this all the time: we've got to secure the border first before we can do anything else. And the irony is, if we had a legal immigration system that was already operating well, and people were entering the country legally rather than illegally, we would reduce these concerns about chaos and disorder, and people would be more in favor of an expansive legal immigration system. We actually kind of have a little bit of a natural experiment with our cousin countries in Australia and Canada. They have, Australia's an island, they call themselves a continent, but and Canada's basically an island too, because they have the United States as a buffer between themselves and any other developing country. And so they get to basically decide, we're going to let in lots of legal immigrants, we're not going to have much illegal immigration. There's some people who try to travel to Australia by boats, and it becomes like this huge controversy, but it's like a tiny fraction of what the United States deals with. And so they actually have, Australia is about 30% foreign born. I mean, this is staggering. If the United States had 30% foreign born, that's doubling our percentage of foreign born. You're talking about 90 or 100 million instead of 45 million immigrants in the United States. So it would be an interesting experiment if we could get to the point where we legalize immigration, we let people into the country legally, and it would dissipate some of this concern, and then we could have political support for that system but it's a catch-22. How do you get to that system when you have the concern? So it's
Yeah.
very, very difficult.
Yeah, one of the things that's very different today than several decades ago is the role of media as well. In particular, you could actually have norms in media when you had the big three broadcasters. Very hard to have that. Economists describe this as what's called a prisoner's dilemma game. So I'll give you a couple quick examples where it's the storytelling trumping evidence-based things. So think about mass shootings right now. The biggest mass shootings, according to the FBI and other people who have investigated this, are glory seekers. And if the media stop reporting the names, stop reporting a lot of the glory seeking, I mean, these people are getting more attention than winning the Emmys Award and the Grammys. We know that, according to the leading experts, that in fact that would have a material impact. If you had three media organizations that somehow could create norms around that, that's one thing. But now you have this diffusion of media, and now it's to almost nobody's incentive to not report, because we will turn to that channel to find that news. And so you have this with so many different policies. Immigration, loosen immigration, that one immigrant, it then becomes the murderer or the rapist and so forth, and then the storytelling around that. If we just didn't allow that person in the country, this person would have been fine. So how do you battle tangible stories with concrete facts and evidence? It's a huge challenge.
Yeah. And Stephanie, the thing I would add, and I hope this is what you guys have as one of your takeaways today, is politicians and the media are talking about the effects of our immigration policy. We have 11 million people without status in the United States. What do we do with them? Do we kick them out? Do we give them amnesty? Do we kick, where we're talking about why do we have so many people without status and how do you change it? And if you start looking at the cause rather than the effect, that could be one step on the way to changing the narrative. I think we have time for one more question. Yeah?
Thank you, Jonathan, and great discussion, but I think it's been pretty depressing for me on my side. So please give us some hope, what is cooking, what may be cooking, the X visa or something else, just to conclude on a happy note, because it is heavy topics. Thank you.
Okay, happy note. Look, I think when it comes to the entrepreneurship, there is a general recognition that we have to move in that direction. And through executive order, which we can debate the merits of executive order over a congressional act, the administrations have been trying to push this. We had it come through the Obama administration. He created DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. The kids that arrived here, they got status. That withstood challenges all throughout the Trump administration. He created an entrepreneur in residence program, which Trump took away, but Biden put back in place. So there is a movement, there is change. I'm trying to be positive. It's just glacially slow, although the glaciers are moving faster now. So I don't know. There's your bit of positive note. Fellas, for conclusions?
Well, my hopeful conclusion is, my hopeful conclusion is just that the public opinion is in a very different place now than it was in the 1990s. In the 1990s, Gallup has been asking the exact same, I'm always skeptical about polls, but when you ask the exact same question since the 1960s, the trends become meaningful. The direction matters. And the public opinion on immigration said that 2/3 of the public in 1995 wanted to restrict immigration. They didn't define legal or illegal. They just said we wanted to restrict immigration. That's declined by half to this year. So that is a massive change in public opinion. It's paralleled by many other changes in public opinion. The difference, the reason why we haven't seen a change in policy as a result of that is that there's a lag. It takes politicians time to catch up to changing public opinion. But I'm more confident now that the public is recognizing the benefits of immigrants. Immigrants now are more diffuse throughout the country than they've ever been in our entire history. So when we look back and look at the 1850s or 1890s when we had immigration at 15% of our population, it was very condensed in the northeast of the United States and in the west. Now it's really quite equally shared across the country. The South is experiencing immigration for the first time. That's part of the backlash, but I think exposure over time will lead to better feelings because immigrants really are contributors, and people will learn with experience that they're not a negative to this country.
Yeah, and just really quickly, I think the attitude is going to fundamentally change. I think countries, again, will start competing for immigrants, and it's going to flip. And the real question is how much pain has to happen before we figure that out. How much does the U.S. population have to decline once we finally realize we're not replacing ourselves without immigration? How much, how long do you have to wait for medical appointments before we realize that we don't have enough as skilled practitioners in the United States? So I think, this may not be the satisfying answer, but in the long run, economists love to talk about the long run, this will change. It's just a question of how much pain do we have to go through first before that happens.
And don't forget about the Jay Treaty. If you're Canadian, you
There
can
you
come
go.
right on. Now, I would really like to give a big round of applause to my fellow panelists. Thank the World Affairs Council and the National Park Service.
Don't forget about the Jay Treaty. That's what our takeaway is tonight. You can all put that on social media, #World Affairs Council. Thanks again to our partners, to our panelists, and to our audience for good discussion and great questions from our members. We didn't come up with the solutions, but we moved the discussion forward and came up with some new ideas, and that's what we're here for. I hope you enjoyed your time with us here at the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia tonight. And we've got a few other programs. If you like this, you might want to check out cryptocurrency and its impact on the world, the global regulation and security on October 6th. We have panelists from the OECD, Wharton law firms, and other experts, and a Norwegian company with their perspective. On October 13th, we'll host the Consul General of Mexico for a World Affairs Table event, which will be followed by a mezcal tasting and a Mexican culinary tour of the country with the chef from Condesa. And it's not all policy and politics. Sometimes we need some tequila to get through these things. And on October 26th, we'll be hosting Chris Matthews, hometown Philadelphian, former board member of the World Affairs of Philadelphia, and his perspective on what's going on in the world. We hope to see you again, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.